May 1766. The heat in Bengal is not merely a temperature, it is a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of dust and humidity that presses the life out of men and rots the very leather of their boots. We are standing on the parade ground of the Monghyr garrison, a lonely outpost on the banks of the Ganges, hundreds of miles from the safety of Calcutta. By all rights, this square should be filled with the sharp bark of sergeants, the rhythmic stomp of boots, and the disciplined machinery of the East India Company's army, the same army that, just 9 years prior, had miraculously conquered a subcontinent. But today, there is only a terrifying silence. The dust settles on a sight that defies military logic. In the center of the officers' mess, a table groans under the weight of paper. These are not maps, nor are they dispatches from the front lines. They are commissions, hundreds of them, the formal legal documents that grant a man the authority to command soldiers of the king and company. One by one, the captains, lieutenants, and ensigns of the Bengal army have walked forward, unbuckled their swords, and thrown their careers onto the pile. This is not a retreat. It is not a surrender to a foreign enemy. It is a mutiny. But it is a mutiny unlike any other in the annals of British history. There are no peasant soldiers storming the Bastille here. There are no downtrodden sailors seizing a frigate. These are gentlemen, men of good breeding, sons of squires and merchants, men who have toasted the king's health every night for years. And yet, in a coordinated strike of breathtaking audacity, the entire officer corps of the British forces in India has resigned en masse. Their logic is cold, precise, and ruthless. They know that without officers, the 20,000 Indian Sepoys who make up the bulk of the army are a leaderless mob. They know that the Maratha cavalry, the most feared horsemen in Asia, are massing on the western borders, watching, waiting for a moment of weakness to sweep down and drive the British into the sea. The officers are betting that the government in Calcutta will panic. They are betting that the terror of an undefended frontier will force the administration to bow to their demands for higher pay and restored privileges. They believe they hold a dagger to the throat of the British Empire. And standing alone against this tide of treason is one man. He does not look like a hero. He does not look like the heaven-born general who stunned the world at Arcot or the tactical genius who shattered the Nawab's army at Plassey. Robert Clive, the Baron of Plassey, is now 41 years old, but he looks 60. His skin is sallow, stretched tight over a frame that seems to vibrate with nervous exhaustion. He is racked by a mysterious, agonizing ailment in his gut that leaves him doubled over in pain for hours at a time. To function, to simply stand upright and speak, he consumes dangerous quantities of opium, a habit that clouds the mind and sours the temper. He is a man surrounded by enemies. The politicians in London hate him for his wealth. The civil servants in Calcutta hate him for his reforms. And now, the very soldiers he led to glory have turned their backs on him. By any reasonable metric, Robert Clive is finished. The conspirators know he is sick. They know he is tired. They expect him to negotiate. They expect the diplomat to emerge, to offer a compromise, to plead with them to pick up their swords and return to their posts. They watch him closely as he steps off the boat at the garrison, looking for the flicker of fear in his eyes. But they have forgotten who Robert Clive is. They have forgotten that this is a man who, as a mere clerk with no military training, once held a crumbling mud fortress for 50 days against an army of 10,000. They have forgotten that his entire life has been a series of gambles where the odds were mathematically impossible, and yet he won every single time. As Clive looks at the pile of resigned commissions, he does not see a bargaining chip. He sees a challenge. He turns to the ringleaders, his voice low, trembling not with fear, but with a cold, suppressed fury. He does not offer them money. He does not offer them amnesty. He offers them a choice that will freeze the blood in their veins. I will not be blackmailed by the servants of the state, he tells them. If I must, I will scour the gutters of Calcutta for clerks and tavern keepers to lead this army. I will promote the sergeants. I will lead the Sepoys myself, but I will not surrender the authority of government to a cabal of mutineers. The air in the room shifts. The confidence of the conspirators falters just for a second, because in that moment, the sick, opium-addicted administrator vanishes and the Lion of Plassey returns. He declares that any officer who does not withdraw his resignation within hours will be court-martialed for mutiny, and the penalty for mutiny in wartime is death. It is a bluff of colossal proportions. Clive has no replacement officers. If the Marathas attack tomorrow, Bengal burns. If the Sepoys realize their white officers have abandoned them, they might turn their muskets on the British civilians. Clive is walking a tightrope over an abyss, holding the entire fate of the British presence in India together with nothing but his own terrifying willpower. This is the story of the White Mutiny, a crisis that history has largely chosen to forget. It lacks the glamour of a cavalry charge or the romance of a last stand, but the stakes were infinitely higher. Had Clive failed here, had he blinked in the face of this internal rebellion, the British Empire in India would have died in its infancy. There would be no Raj, no global dominion, no reshaping of the modern world. What follows is not a tale of tactical flanking maneuvers or artillery barrages. It is a psychological thriller played out in the sweltering heat of the Indian summer. It is the story of a man whose body was failing him, whose friends had betrayed him, and who stood completely alone against the collapse of his life's work. It is the story of how Robert Clive, in his darkest hour, saved the empire not with a sword, but with a stare. To understand how we reached this precipice, to understand why these officers were willing to risk the gallows to defy the most famous soldier of the age, and to understand the darkness that was consuming Robert Clive's soul, we must wind the clock back. We must look away from the dusty parade ground of Monghyr and cast our eyes across the ocean, to a world that was already setting itself on fire. To understand the sheer madness of the mutiny at Monghyr, we must first understand the world that birthed it. It is 1765, 1 year before the crisis, and the map of the world has been redrawn in blood. The 7 Years' War, perhaps the first true world war in human history, has finally burned itself out. From the freezing forests of North America to the tropical coastlines of the Philippines, the guns have fallen silent. And standing amidst the smoke, battered but triumphant, is Great Britain. On paper, it is the greatest victory in the history of the island nation. The French have been humiliated, their imperial ambitions crushed. Britain now stands as the undisputed master of the seas and the dominant colonial power on the face of the earth. In London, the coffee houses are buzzing with talk of glory, of trade monopolies, and of a golden age that will last 1,000 years. But peel back the gold leaf, and you find rot. Nowhere is this rot more visible or more dangerous than in the prized jewel of this new empire, Bengal. To the average Englishman in 1765, Bengal is not a province to be governed. It is a vault to be looted. The East India Company, a private trading corporation that now finds itself ruling millions of subjects, has completely lost its moral compass. With the strong hand of Robert Clive back in England, enjoying his retirement and his peerage, the men left behind in Calcutta have descended into an orgy of greed that historians will later call the rapacity. Imagine a gold rush, but without the law. Young men, mere boys really, arrive from England on company ships, not to serve the state, but to make their fortunes and leave as quickly as possible. They are paid a pittance in official salary, but that does not matter. The real money is in the gifts. Every time a local ruler is toppled, every time a contract is signed, vast sums of rupees change hands. Officers and clerks who arrived with nothing are returning to London after 3 years with fortunes that rival the oldest dukes in the land. They are building massive country estates, buying seats in Parliament, and parading their wealth with a vulgarity that shocks the establishment. They are known, derisively, as nabobs. But in Bengal, their greed is tearing the country apart. The company's servants have monopolized the trade in salt, betel nut, and tobacco. They force local merchants to buy at inflated prices and sell at a loss. They undermine the authority of the local courts, protecting their own private armies of thugs who terrorize the countryside. The lush, fertile delta of the Ganges, once the granary of India, is bleeding dry. The peasantry is starving. The local administration has collapsed. This is not just a humanitarian tragedy, it is a strategic suicide. While the British officers in Calcutta are busy counting their gold and drinking claret, a storm is gathering on the horizon. The power vacuum left by the collapse of the Mughal Empire has not just been filled by the British. Rising from the rugged Deccan Plateau in the west is the Maratha Confederacy. We must not mistake these men for the disorganized tribal levies the British have faced before. The Marathas are a warrior nation, disciplined, mobile, and ruthless. Their light cavalry can cover 50 miles a day, striking deep into enemy territory and vanishing before a counterattack can be mustered. They have watched the rise of the British with a cold, calculating eye. They know that the Ferenghis, the foreigners, are powerful in battle, but they also see the corruption eating away at the company's soul. They see an army commanded by merchants who care more for their ledgers than their perimeter defenses. The Maratha generals know that Bengal is rich, and more importantly, they know it is vulnerable. They are massing on the borders of Oudh, the buffer state that protects Bengal. They are probing, testing, waiting for the moment when the British discipline cracks. If the Marathas invade in force, there is no guarantee the company's army can stop them. The British forces are scattered, poorly led, and demoralized by the very corruption that enriches their officers. And back in London, the bill is finally coming due. The East India Company, despite looting the wealth of Bengal, is somehow facing bankruptcy. The sheer scale of the corruption means that the money is flowing into the pockets of individuals, not the company's treasury. The stock price, which had soared on the news of Clive's earlier victories, begins to wobble. Panic sets in at East India House on Leadenhall Street. The directors realize with horror that their golden goose is dying. They face a terrifying paradox. They have conquered an empire, yet they are losing money. Parliament is furious. The king is concerned. There is talk in the halls of Westminster that the company should be stripped of its charter, that the crown should take over India directly. But the government is weak, crippled by debt from the 7 Years' War. They do not have the money or the soldiers to garrison a subcontinent. They need the company to fix its own mess. But who can fix it? Who has the authority to walk into a den of thieves and tell them the party is over? Who has the military genius to hold back the Maratha hordes while simultaneously purging the civil administration? The directors look around the table and they realize there is only one name. It is a name that many of them hate. A man they have sued, a man they have insulted, a man they consider arrogant, difficult, and uncontrollable. Robert Clive. The irony is palpable. The very men who resent Clive's wealth and fame are now forced to beg him to save them. They know that sending anyone else is a death sentence. A lesser man would be bribed. A weaker man would be ignored. A softer man would be eaten alive by the wolves in Calcutta. They need a dictator. They need a man who does not care about popularity, who fears no one, and whose very name strikes terror into the hearts of both Indian princes and corrupt British officials. But the Robert Clive they are calling upon is not the same man who sailed home in triumph 5 years ago. He is in the grip of a terrible melancholy. The nervous ambition that drove him in his youth has curdled into a dark, brooding depression. He is constantly ill, his body waging a war against itself. He has enemies in Parliament who are sharpening their knives, waiting for him to fail. When the summons comes, Clive initially refuses. Why should he go? He has his fortune, he has his title, he has his wife and children. Why would he risk his health and his reputation to return to the land of death, to clean up a mess made by others? He knows that if he accepts this mission, he will be declaring war on his own countrymen. He knows that stripping the officers of their perks and the civilians of their illegal trade will make him the most hated man in India. Yet there is something in Clive that cannot resist the call of the impossible. Perhaps it is duty, perhaps it is arrogance, or perhaps it is the knowledge that the empire he built is crumbling and he cannot bear to watch it fall. He accepts the role of governor and commander-in-chief, but he sets his own terms. He demands absolute power. He demands the right to overrule the council in Calcutta. He demands the authority to act as a sovereign. The directors, desperate and terrified of the crashing stock prices, agree to everything. As Clive prepares to sail in 1765, he writes to a friend, "I am going out to a scene of anarchy and confusion. I am going to cleanse the Augean stables." He knows he is sailing into a hurricane. He knows the officers will resist. He knows the civilians will conspire against him. But he does not yet know the depths of the betrayal that awaits him. He does not know that the very men he is coming to command are already whispering of rebellion. The stage is set. The stakes are total. On one side, the infinite wealth of the Indies and the future of the British Empire. On the other, the rotting corruption of the nabobs and the thundering hooves of the Maratha cavalry. And sailing into the center of the storm is one sick, moody, brilliant man, armed with nothing but a piece of paper and a will of iron. The world is ablaze, and Robert Clive is the only fireman left. But before he can fight the fires, he must first survive the men who lit them. We often prefer our heroes to be frozen in the amber of their youth. We remember Alexander at Gorgamla, not the drunkard dying in Babylon. We remember Nelson at Trafalgar, not the infidelity and the scandal. And so it is with Robert Clive. The popular imagination paints him forever in a scarlet coat, sword in hand, standing atop the ramparts of Arcot or amidst the mango groves of Plassey, a young, invincible god of war. But the man who boarded the East Indiaman Kent in June of 1765 was a ghost of that former self. To understand the fury he was about to unleash on the Bengal army, we must first look into the eyes of the man himself. He is no longer Clive of India. He is Baron Clive of Plassey, an Irish peerage that grants him the title but not the respect of the English aristocracy. He is the richest subject in Europe, possessing a fortune so vast it unsettles the mind of the Georgian gentry. He owns finest estates, the most expensive jewelry, and wields enough political influence to buy boroughs by the dozen. Yet he is the most miserable man in London. The establishment despises him. To the old families of England, the dukes and the earls whose lineage stretches back to the Norman conquest, Clive is a parvenu, a vulgar upstart. They sneer at his wealth, calling it blood money. The press hounds him, caricaturing him as Lord Vulture, a man who fattened himself on the famine of Bengal. He is isolated, surrounded by sycophants who want his money and aristocrats who want him gone. But the true enemy is not society, it is his own body. Since his youth, Clive had suffered from a mysterious, agonizing complaint of the gut, spasmodic pains that would leave him writhing on the floor, unable to speak or think. In the 18th century, medicine had only one answer for such agony: opium. By the time he prepares for his final voyage, Clive is heavily dependent on the drug. It dulls the pain, but it amplifies the darkness in his mind. He is prone to swinging moods, bouts of nervous melancholy, where he sits in silence for hours, staring at nothing. This is a man living in constant, low-level torture, a physical and mental anguish that would have broken a lesser spirit years ago. So why return? Why leave the comfort of Berkeley Square? Why leave his beloved wife, Margaret, and his children? Why risk a sea voyage that claimed the lives of thousands, only to return to a climate that destroyed his health, to govern a colony that he had already conquered? The answer lies in the peculiar psychology of Robert Clive. He was a man who could not exist without a crisis. Peace bored him. It allowed the demons of his depression to creep in. He needed the impossible to feel alive. When the directors of the East India Company came to him, hats in hand, begging him to save their investment, it was not the money that swayed him. He refused the salary. He refused the jagged edges of negotiation. He accepted only on the condition of absolute authority. He was returning not as a merchant, nor even as a general, but as a dictator. He saw himself as a Roman consul, granted emergency powers to save the Republic. "I am come," he told a friend, "to cleanse the Augean stables." The reference to Hercules is telling. He knew the task was mythical in scale. He knew he would be fighting the very culture of greed that the company had fostered. And perhaps, in the dark recesses of his opium-clouded mind, he knew that this was a suicide mission for his reputation. He was going to sacrifice his popularity to save the empire. The voyage itself seemed to conspire against him. The journey to India was never safe, but for Clive, it was a prelude to the struggle ahead. The ship Kent was driven off course, nearly wrecked on the coast of Brazil. For weeks, they were stranded, the great savior of India kicking his heels in a foreign port, consuming his opium and brooding on the task ahead. He used the time to write, drafting the orders that would tear the administration of Bengal apart. He wrote with a venomous clarity, detailing exactly how he would strip the officers of their double batter, how he would ban the private trade, how he would crush any dissent. There is a terrifying focus to Clive in these months. He is a man stripping away all the softness of life. He knows he has no allies waiting for him in Calcutta. The council members there are the very men he intends to fire. The officers are the men he intends to impoverish. He is sailing into a nest of vipers, and his only weapon is his own towering reputation. When the Kent finally navigates the treacherous silt banks of the Hooghly River and drops anchor at Calcutta, the reception is icy. There are no cheering crowds. The gun salutes are formal, grudging. The men who come to greet him, the councillors in their silk coats and powdered wigs, look at him with guarded eyes. They see the lines of pain etched into his face, the heaviness of his step. They exchange glances. They think he is a spent force. They think they can outweight him, maneuver around him, perhaps even control him. They are catastrophically wrong. Clive does not rest. He does not acclimating to the heat. He strikes immediately. Within days of his arrival, he dismisses the entire council. Men who had ruled Bengal like petty kings are suddenly stripped of their power and told to book passage home. He installs his own select committee, handpicked men loyal only to him. He tears up the existing treaties with the local Nawabs and rewrites the entire political structure of India, securing the Diwani, the right to collect revenues, for the company, effectively making a trading corporation the legal sovereign of Bengal. It is a breathtaking display of administrative violence. He works 18 hours a day, fueled by duty and laudanum. He ignores the piles of hate mail that begin to arrive. He ignores the snubbing at social functions. He is utterly indifferent to being liked. He only cares about being obeyed. But as he purges the civil service, a darker threat is festering in the cantonments. The soldiers are watching. The officers, the captains and majors who lead the brigades have watched their civilian counterparts be stripped of their illegal fortunes. They see the lion tearing through the administration, and they know, with a sinking dread, that they are next. Clive knows it too. He knows that touching the army's pay is the most dangerous move a ruler can make. History is littered with the corpses of generals who tried to cut the wages of their troops, but Clive is driven by a rigid, almost fanatical sense of justice. He believes the army has become a sink of iniquity, that the officers have forgotten their duty to the king in their pursuit of rupees. He is no longer the soldier's friend, he is their judge. As the winter of 1765 turns into the blistering spring of 1766, Clive sits in Government House, isolated and in pain. He has saved the treasury, he has secured the borders, but he has made enemies of every single Englishman in Bengal. The atmosphere in Calcutta is toxic. Men cross the street to avoid him. At dinner parties, glasses are raised to his health with a sarcasm that borders on treason. And in the remote stations, in the mess halls of Monghyr and Patna, the whispers stop being whispers. The officers stop complaining and start plotting. They look at the sick, lonely man in the governor's palace, and they decide that the lion is too old, too weak, and too isolated to fight back. They mistake his physical frailty for weakness of will. They are about to wake the dragon. Clive is tired. He wants to go home. He wants to see his children, but he senses the storm coming. He writes to the directors in London, "I expect to be murdered." It is not a figure of speech. He genuinely believes that his reforms might cost him his life, but he does not flinch. He sits at his desk, dips his quill in ink, and prepares to issue the order that will strip the officers of their beloved field allowance. He is the lion in winter, scarred, aching, and surrounded by jackals, but he has one final hunt left in him. To govern an empire is a thankless task, but to reform one is an act of war. Robert Clive sits in the stifling heat of the governor's office in Calcutta, staring at a directive from the Court of Directors in London. It is a piece of paper that has been ignored by every governor before him. It is a simple instruction, really, cut the expenses. But Clive knows that in the volatile, gold-obsessed world of British India, this instruction is not a policy change. It is a spark dropped into a keg of gunpowder. The specific issue at hand is something called double batter. To the modern ear, it sounds like a trivial accounting term, a minor bureaucratic adjustment. But to the officers of the Bengal Army in 1766, double batter is the difference between a life of gentlemanly comfort and a life of poverty. It is a field allowance, a bonus payment originally granted by the puppet Nawab Mir Jafar after the victory at Plassey. It was meant to be a temporary gift, a thank you to the officers who had placed him on the throne. But in the way of all temporary government privileges, it had calcified into a permanent right. The officers had come to view it not as a bonus, but as their due. It was the price of their blood. For years, the company directors in London had railed against it. They argued, quite correctly, that the Bengal army was the highest-paid military force in the world. A captain in Bengal earned more than a colonel in the king's service in Europe. The cost of this allowance was bleeding the treasury dry, consuming nearly half of the company's total revenue. Previous governors had received orders to abolish it, and each one had quietly tucked the orders into a drawer, too terrified of the army's reaction to enforce them. They preferred to let the corruption rot the system rather than face the wrath of the men with the muskets. But Robert Clive is not a man who hides from confrontation. He is a man who seeks it out. On a humid morning in early 1766, the order goes out. Effective immediately, the double batter is abolished. The officers' field pay is to be slashed by half. The reaction is not immediate violence. It is a collective gasp of disbelief, followed by a low, rumbling growl of indignation that rolls across the cantonments of northern India. In the officers' messes at Monghyr, Patna and Allahabad, the news hits like a physical blow. These men are already angry. They are watching Clive strip the civil service of their private trade, and now he is reaching into their pockets. We must understand the psychology of these men to understand the tragedy that follows. They do not see themselves as greedy mercenaries. They see themselves as the architects of the empire. They are the ones who march through the monsoon rains, who die of malaria and cholera in the jungle, who stand in the line of fire against the French and the Marathas. They look at the civilians in Calcutta, the quill drivers and merchants, living in palaces, drinking fine wines, and growing fat on the trade that the army's bayonets protect. And now, the man who made the biggest fortune of them all, the man who took a jaguar's share of the loot after Plassey, is telling them to tighten their belts. The hypocrisy is galling. It tastes like ash in their mouths. Clive has forgotten us, they whisper over their evening Madeira. He has become one of them. He is a peer of the realm now, a favorite of the king. He doesn't remember what it's like to sweat in a wool coat in 40-degree heat. The resentment is particularly acute because of the timing. The army is currently deployed on the frontier, guarding against the looming Maratha threat. They are on active service, living in tents, far from the comforts of Calcutta. To cut their pay while they are staring down the enemy feels like a betrayal of the most sacred bond between a commander and his troops. It is a violation of the unwritten contract. We bleed for you, and you pay us. Clive, for his part, is unmoved by their complaints. He argues that even with the cut, the Bengal officers are still handsomely paid compared to their counterparts in Madras or Bombay. He sees the double batter as a cancer, a symbol of the licentiousness that has overtaken the company. He believes that luxury ruins discipline. He wants an army of Spartans, not an army of Sybarites. But Clive makes a fatal miscalculation. He assumes that the officers will grumble, write angry letters, and then ultimately submit to the chain of command. He relies on the ingrained hierarchy of the British military, the deep-seated conditioning that makes mutiny unthinkable to a gentleman. He underestimates the power of collective victimhood. He does not see that he has handed them a common cause. Before this order, the officers were a disparate group, divided by rivalries and petty jealousies. Now, they are united by a single, burning grievance. The order to abolish double batter acts as a binding agent, fusing the officer corps into a solid block of resistance. In the sweltering nights of April, the conversation in the mess tents shifts. The complaints about money stop. The tone becomes darker, more conspiratorial. Men stop talking about their debts and start talking about their power. They realize with a sudden, intoxicating clarity that they are the only thing standing between the company and destruction. Without them, there is no army. Without the army, there is no revenue. Without revenue, the company collapses. They hold the keys to the kingdom. The idea begins to take root, a seditious, dangerous idea. What if they simply refused? What if they all stood together? Clive cannot court-martial everyone. He cannot hang an entire officer corps. If they act as one, they are untouchable. The poisoned chalice of reform has been poured. Clive has offered it to the army, demanding they drink it for the good of the company. But instead of swallowing the bitter medicine, the officers are looking at the glass and wondering if they should smash it against the wall. Unknown to Clive, the letters are already being written, not letters of protest to the government, but letters between the brigades. Secret couriers are riding through the night, carrying messages from Monghyr to Patna, from Patna to Allahabad. A network is forming. The grip of discipline is loosening, replaced by the tight handshake of conspiracy. Clive sits in Calcutta, believing the matter is settled. He is busy with other reforms, fighting the civilians, fighting his illness. He thinks he has lanced the boil. He does not realize he has merely driven the infection deep into the bone. The rebellion is no longer a possibility, it is a certainty. The only question now is when the blow will fall and whether the sick man in the governor's palace will survive it. There is a silence in history that is often louder than the roar of cannon fire. It is the silence of men huddled in a tent by candlelight, passing a piece of paper from hand to hand, their signatures scratching a pact that could hang them all. Throughout April of 1766, the Great North Road and the river barges of the Ganges became the arteries of a conspiracy that was unprecedented in the history of the British Army. To the casual observer, the daily routine of the Bengal army appeared unchanged. The drills continued, the sentries walked their posts, and the Union Jack was raised at dawn. But beneath this veneer of discipline, the officer corps had ceased to be a military hierarchy. It had transformed into a secret society. The organization of the plot was terrifying in its efficiency. It was not the work of a drunken rabble. It was the work of educated men, logisticians, and strategists. They applied the same meticulous planning to their treason as they did to a campaign against the Mughals. A secret correspondence committee was established, linking the three great brigades stationed at Monghyr, Patna, and Allahabad. Riders were kept in constant motion, carrying sealed letters that outlined the terms of their rebellion. The plan they devised was simple, brutal, and they believed foolproof. They would not mutiny in the traditional sense. They would not turn their guns on their superiors or march on Calcutta. Such actions would be crude, and more importantly, they would be undeniably criminal. Instead, they chose a weapon that was far more subtle and far more devastating: resignation. The officers agreed that on a specific date, the 1st of June, every single captain and subaltern in the three brigades would resign his commissions simultaneously. They would refuse to serve. They would lay down their swords, not in surrender to an enemy, but in protest to their government. The genius of the plan lay in the numbers. If one officer resigns in the face of the enemy, he is a coward and a deserter. He can be shot. But if 200 officers resign at the exact same moment, that is not desertion. That is a collapse of the state. They reasoned that Clive, faced with an army of 20,000 leaderless sepoys and a hostile frontier, would have no choice but to capitulate. He would have to beg them to return. He would have to restore the double batter, and likely he would have to resign as governor in disgrace. To ensure that no man wavered, the conspirators bound themselves with oaths that bordered on the fanatical. They swore on the Bible to stand together. They swore that if any one of them was singled out for punishment, the others would refuse to return to duty until he was reinstated. They created a common stock, a financial war chest to support those officers who might be stripped of their pay during the standoff. And here the plot thickened into true treachery. The money for this war chest did not come from the soldiers' meager savings. It came from Calcutta. The civilian merchants, the very men Clive had purged from the administration for corruption, saw an opportunity for revenge. They hated the governor as much as the soldiers did. In a quiet, shameful alliance, the civilians of Calcutta poured money into the officers' fund, subscribing nearly 140,000 rupees to finance the rebellion. The civil service was effectively paying the army to overthrow the government. At the center of this web sat Sir Robert Fletcher, the commander of the 1st Brigade at Monghyr. Fletcher is one of the great villains of this story, a man of boundless ambition and zero moral ballast. While he pretended to support Clive, writing obsequious letters to the governor, he was secretly encouraging his subordinates to rebel. He played the role of the sympathetic father figure, telling his young officers that he understood their grievances, that their cause was just, and that he would not stand in their way. He was the accelerant in the fire, hoping to ride the chaos to the governorship himself once Clive was broken. By May, the conspiracy of the sword was complete. The letters had been signed, the dates were set, the money was banked. The officers sat back and waited, a smug confidence settling over the mess halls. They drank toasts to the Union and the batter. They laughed at the thought of old Clive in Calcutta, imagining the look on his face when the avalanche of resignations hit his desk. They were suffering from a fatal delusion. They believed they were dealing with a politician. They believed that Clive operated by the rules of logic and self-preservation. They calculated that he would prioritize the safety of the province over his own pride. They did not understand that they were dealing with a force of nature. They also failed to realize the gravity of what they were doing. In their minds, this was a labor dispute, a strike, a hard-nosed negotiation between gentlemen. They had convinced themselves that their resignation was a legal right, that a man could not be forced to serve against his will. They had forgotten the articles of war. They had forgotten that they were on active service within striking distance of the enemy. In the eyes of the law, their strike was not a resignation. It was a conspiracy to mutiny in the face of the enemy. The penalty was death. As the deadline approached, the conspirators grew bolder. They began to treat the few loyal officers with open contempt. They held mock funerals for Clive. They were drunk on their own solidarity, convinced that they had checkmated the most famous general of the age. They saw themselves as the Roman Praetorian Guard, the true power behind the throne, asserting their right to dictate terms to the emperor. But a secret shared by 200 men is no secret at all. Rumors began to drift down the river. Loyal spies, few though they were, sent frantic warnings to Calcutta. The wind whispered that something was wrong in the north. The air was too still. The officers were too quiet. The trap was set. The conspirators had loaded the gun, aimed it at the heart of the British Empire, and placed their fingers on the trigger. All that was left was to squeeze. They waited for Clive to flinch. They expected panic. They expected a frantic courier arriving with a compromise. Instead, they would get something else entirely. They were about to discover that dragging a dying lion out of his den does not make him any less dangerous. It simply makes him angry. It is late April, 1766. The humidity in Calcutta is rising, clinging to the skin like a wet shroud. In the governor's mansion, the lights are burning low. Robert Clive sits alone, nursing the dull, grinding pain in his stomach with another dose of opium. The city outside is asleep, oblivious to the fact that the sword of Damocles is hanging by a single, fraying thread over their heads. Then a courier arrives. The letter is from Sir Robert Fletcher at Monghyr. It is couched in the language of false concern, a masterpiece of duplicity. Fletcher claims to have just discovered that his officers are intent on resigning en masse within a few days. He feigns helplessness, suggesting that perhaps the governor should consider restoring the batter to avoid a catastrophe. Clive reads the letter. He reads the enclosed list of names. He sees the scale of it. This is not a protest, it is a coup. In that moment, the mutineers lost. They had banked everything on Clive reacting as a politician. They expected him to weigh the risks, to consult his counsel, to wring his hands and look for a compromise. They expected the sick old man to panic. But as Clive stares at the evidence of treason, the fog of opium lifts. The pain in his gut is forgotten. The lethargy vanishes. In its place, a cold, crystalline clarity descends upon him. For the first time in years, Robert Clive is at war. He does not summon the council to debate. He summons his secretaries and begins to dictate. The speed and ferocity of his response are terrifying. He understands instantly that negotiation is death. If the government yields to the army now, the army will rule Bengal forever. The civil power will be nothing but a puppet of the Praetorian Guard. There will be no compromise, he tells his stunned aides. These men have mistaken moderation for weakness. They shall find their error. That night the midnight dispatches are written. They are orders of breathtaking boldness. Clive writes to the council at Madras, 1,000 miles away, demanding every spare officer they have. Send them all, he commands. Send me every captain, every lieutenant, every ensign you can find, strip your own garrisons if you must. The fate of India depends on it. But Madras is weeks away. He needs officers now. So Clive turns to the civilian population of Calcutta. He issues a proclamation that shocks the city. He calls for volunteers from the merchant class, the writers, the clerks, the commercial agents. He offers them immediate commissions in the army. He orders the promotion of sergeants and corporals from the ranks. He is ready to replace the gentlemen of the officer corps with shopkeepers and rough-handed NCOs. It is a massive insult to the military aristocracy, a declaration that he would rather be led by amateurs than by traitors. He sends orders to the loyal commanders at the minor outposts: arrest the ringleaders, send them to Calcutta in chains. If they resist, shoot them. There is no hesitation in his pen strokes. He declares that any officer who resigns his commission will be instantly dismissed from the company's service and barred from ever holding office in India again. He strips them of their future. He burns the bridge behind them. But sitting in Calcutta is not enough. Clive knows that paper orders can be ignored. He knows that Fletcher is playing a double game. He knows that the sight of a new commission for a sergeant might not stop a mutinous captain from seizing the artillery. He stands up from his desk. He calls for his carriage. He calls for his river barges. His doctors protest. They tell him he is in no condition to travel. The heat of the coming summer is lethal. The journey up the Ganges to the remote garrisons will take weeks of grueling travel. They warn him that the stress alone could kill him. Clive ignores them. He packs a few trunks. He gathers a small retinue of loyal aides. He is going to the front. He is going to ride into the heart of the mutiny, unarmed, and look these men in the eye. It is a decision of supreme arrogance and supreme courage. He is betting his life that his name alone still carries enough magic to break the spell of the conspiracy. He is betting that when the Lion of Plassey walks onto the parade ground, the wolves will remember who is master. As the dawn breaks over the Hooghly River, Robert Clive steps onto his barge. He leaves behind the safety of the capital. He is sailing into a country that is largely hostile to an army that has sworn to defy him. He is physically broken, mentally exhausted, and practically alone. But as the current catches the boat, turning the bow upstream toward Monghyr, the mood in the governor's camp changes. The administrator is gone. The general has returned, and he is bringing a storm with him. The journey up the Ganges in May is a descent into a kind of madness. The river, usually the lifeline of Bengal, turns into a sluggish, steaming cauldron. The sun hammers down with a ferocity that cracks the earth and boils the blood. The air is so thick with moisture that every breath feels like inhaling warm soup. It is a climate that breaks healthy men, that sends fevers raging through the strongest constitutions, and into this furnace sails Robert Clive. He is traveling not with an army, but with a skeleton crew. A few aides, a handful of servants, and a distinct lack of heavy weaponry. To any observer on the riverbanks, it looks like a funeral procession. The governor lies in his cabin, the shutters drawn against the blinding glare, his body twisted in agony. The pain in his gut is constant now, a jagged knife that never dulls. He survives on a diet of broth and opium, his eyes hollow, his skin the color of parchment. But the physical wreck in the cabin is secondary to the force of will that propels the barge upstream. As the miles drag on, a strange phenomenon begins to occur. The news of Clive's departure from Calcutta travels faster than his boats. It races ahead on the wind, carried by market runners and village gossip, filtering into the officers' mess at Monghyr. Clive is coming. The words strike a chill into the conspiracy that no threat of court-martial ever could. The officers had prepared for everything, or so they thought. They had prepared for legal arguments. They had prepared for a standoff with the council. They had even prepared for the possibility of a military engagement against loyalist troops. But they had not prepared for him. They had not prepared to look into the face of the man who had made kings and broken empires. In the candlelight of the conspirators' tents, the bravado begins to evaporate. They start to remember stories. They remember that this is the man who, at the Battle of Kavripakam, walked calmly through a storm of musket fire to rally his troops. They remember that he is a man who once put a pistol to the head of a card cheat and pulled the trigger, only to have the gun misfire twice, a man who believes, with a terrifying certainty, that he is destined to conquer. Panic begins to set in. The solidarity of the sword starts to fracture. The captains look at the majors, and the lieutenants look at the captains. Who will be the first to speak when the lion arrives? Who will be the one to tell Robert Clive to his face that he has no authority? The officers realize with a sinking dread that their anonymity is gone. They are no longer a faceless block of resignation. They are individuals about to face judgment. Meanwhile, on the river, Clive is relentless. He refuses to stop for rest. He dictates letters between bouts of illness, sending riders ahead to the next outpost. His instructions are precise and cold. He orders loyal commanders to secure the artillery parks. He orders the Sepoys, the Indian troops, to be kept under arms and separated from the European officers. This is the masterstroke of his psychological warfare. Clive knows that the British officers see themselves as the masters of India. They believe the Sepoys will follow them blindly. But Clive knows better. He knows the Sepoys fight for the Company Bahadur, the Great Company, and more specifically, they fight for Sabat Jung, the Constant Warrior, the name they gave Clive years ago. He is gambling that if he pits the brown soldiers against the white officers, the soldiers will choose him. It is a terrifying prospect, a race war engineered to save the army from itself. As the barge nears Monghyr, the weather turns violent. The pre-monsoon storms roll in, turning the sky black and the river into a churning frenzy. Thunder shakes the boat, mirroring the turmoil on land. Most men would seek shelter. Clive orders the pilot to press on. He wants to arrive in the middle of the storm. He wants his arrival to feel elemental, inevitable. Inside the garrison at Monghyr, the atmosphere is suffocating. Sir Robert Fletcher, the double-dealing commander, is losing control. He tries to rally his men, telling them to stand firm, but he is already writing secret letters to Clive, trying to distance himself from the very mutiny he encouraged. The rats are looking for the lifeboats. The officers gather on the ramparts, scanning the river through the driving rain. They are armed. They are angry. They have sworn oaths on the Bible. But as they see the silhouette of the governor's barge emerging from the mist, a silence falls over them. It is the silence of men who realize they have made a catastrophic miscalculation. Clive's boat does not slow down to ask for permission to dock. It slams against the jetty with a thud of finality. There is no fanfare, no bugles, just the creak of timber and the howl of the wind. The gangplank is lowered. The officers on the walls grip their swords. This is the moment. They outnumber him 100 to 1. They have the guns. They have the fortress. They could arrest him. They could shoot him. They could turn the barge around and send it back to Calcutta. But no one moves. From the dark interior of the cabin, a figure emerges. He is leaning heavily on a cane. He looks frail, almost skeletal in the gloom, but when he lifts his head, the eyes are burning with a ferocity that makes strong men look at their boots. Robert Clive steps onto the soil of Monghyr. He does not wait for a guard of honor. He begins to walk, slow and painful, straight toward the gates of the fortress. He is walking into the lion's den, armed with nothing but his history. The impossible climax has begun. The ride is over. The staring contest is about to begin, and the fate of the British Empire rests on whether a sick man can shout down a storm. The gates of the Monghyr fortress swing open with a groan of rusted iron that echoes like a gunshot across the parade ground. It is May the 15th, 1766. The storm that battered the river has passed, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and an atmosphere so heavy with humidity that the air feels solid. Inside the walls, the entire European garrison is drawn up in formation. 200 officers standing shoulder to shoulder, their red coats stained with sweat and the dust of the dry season. They are armed, they are angry, and they are waiting. At the center of their formation, there is a palpable sense of power. These are the men who conquered Bengal. They are young, dangerous, and convinced of their own righteousness. They have spent the last few weeks drinking to their union, swearing oaths on the Bible, and convincing themselves that the company cannot exist without them. They stand with their hands resting on the hilts of their swords, watching the main gate with a mixture of arrogance and anxiety. They expect a delegation. They expect a lawyer with a briefcase full of compromises. What they get is a ghost. Walking through the gate is not a retinue of diplomats, but a small, limping figure. Robert Clive moves with the slow, deliberate gait of a man whose body is a cage of pain. He leans heavily on a cane, his knuckles white against the polished wood. His face is a mask of sallow skin and deep-set eyes, ravaged by the opium he took just to survive the morning. To the young ensigns in the back rows, he must look like a ruin, a relic of a bygone war who should be in a bath chair in Bath, not a fortress in Bihar. But as he gets closer, the silence in the garrison deepens. The ruin does not look down, he does not falter. He walks straight toward the center of the formation, his eyes scanning the faces of the men who have betrayed him. And in those eyes, there is no fear. There is only a cold, terrifying contempt. This is the staring contest. On one side, the collective weight of the Bengal army, the physical force of the British Empire in India. On the other, the sheer psychological mass of one man's legend. Clive stops 10 paces from the front rank. He does not draw a sword. He does not need to. He simply stands there, swaying slightly in the heat, and lets the silence stretch until it becomes unbearable. He forces them to look at him. He forces them to look at the man who gave them the very empire they are now holding for ransom. When he finally speaks, his voice is not the thunderous roar of a drill sergeant. It is low, raspy, vibrating with a quiet, lethal intensity. He does not address them as gentlemen. He does not address them as officers. "I am surprised," he begins, his gaze flicking from one face to another, "to find that I am commanding a regiment of assassins." The word hangs in the humid air. A murmur of outrage ripples through the ranks, but no one steps forward. Clive cuts through the noise. He tells them that they have mistaken their profession. Soldiers fight the enemy. These men, he declares, are merely holding a pistol to the head of their own mother country. He asks them if they are proud. He asks them if this is how they wish to be remembered, not as the heroes of Plassey, but as the greedy tradesmen who sold their honor for a few extra rupees a day. It is a masterful dismantling of their ego. Clive knows these men. He knows that beneath the greed, they are desperate to be seen as gentlemen. By denying them that status, by treating them like rebellious servants, he strikes at the very core of their identity. "You believe you are indispensable," Clive says, his voice rising now, fueled by the adrenaline that is temporarily masking his pain. "You are wrong. I would rather see this army disbanded and the company ruined than submit to such insolence. I will stand alone if I must. I will commission the clerks from the counting houses. I will arm the free merchants. I will lead the Sepoys myself, but I will not be dictated to by a rabble." And then he plays his ace. The officers at Monghyr had assumed, with the casual racism of the era, that the Indian troops, the Sepoys, would naturally follow their white officers in any conflict. They viewed the native soldiers as tools, extensions of their own will. They had not counted on the fact that to the Sep, the company was not a board of directors in London. The company was Clive. He was Sabat Jung, the invincible warrior. As Clive speaks, a sound comes from the ramparts above, the unmistakable clatter of muskets being leveled. The officers look up. Lined along the walls, looking down into the parade ground, are the Sepoy battalions. They are fully armed. Their muskets are loaded, and their barrels are pointed not outward at the jungle, but inward, directly at the British officers. The trap is sprung. Clive had sent secret orders ahead of his arrival to the loyal Indian commanders. He had reminded them of their old allegiance. He had promised them rewards for loyalty. And now, the white officers find themselves standing in a kill box, surrounded by the very men they thought they commanded. The racial hierarchy of the colonial army has been inverted in a single stroke. The masters are prisoners, the servants are the jailers. The confidence of the mutiny shatters. You can see it in the body language of the officers. Hands drop away from sword hilts, heads lower. The solidarity that held them together evaporates, replaced by the primal instinct for self-preservation. They realize that Clive is not bluffing. He is perfectly willing to order the Sepoys to fire on the king's officers if they do not submit. He is willing to commit the ultimate taboo to save the state. Sir Robert Fletcher, the commander of the brigade and the secret architect of the mutiny, watches this unfold with horror. He sees the wind changing. In a display of breathtaking cynicism, he suddenly steps forward, attempting to align himself with Clive. He starts shouting at his own men, ordering them to disperse, pretending that he has been trying to quell the rebellion all along. Clive looks at Fletcher. He knows the man is a snake. He knows Fletcher is the ringleader, but Clive is a pragmatist. He needs the mutiny broken now. He can deal with Fletcher later. He allows the charade, letting Fletcher order the men to their barracks. But the confrontation is not quite over. There are still diehards, men who are too angry or too drunk to back down. One captain, his face flushed with rage, steps out of the ranks. He shouts that he will not serve without his pay, that he is a free man, and that he is leaving the fort this instant. Clive walks up to him. The distance between them is inches. The captain is young, strong, and has a hand on his sword. Clive is old, sick, and armed only with a cane. "You may leave," Clive says softly, "but you will leave without your commission, and if you attempt to incite others to follow you, you will be shot where you stand." He turns his back on the captain. It is the ultimate gesture of dominance. He turns his back on an armed man, trusting in his own authority so completely that he knows the man will not strike. And he is right. The captain freezes. He looks at the Sepoys on the wall. He looks at the backs of his retreating comrades, and he crumbles. He throws his hat into the dust and weeps. The mutiny at Monghyr is broken. It did not end with a bang, but with a whimper of shame. Clive does not stop to rest. He does not celebrate. He retires to the commander's quarters, and the moment the door closes, he collapses. The adrenaline fades, and the pain rushes back in like a tidal wave. His aides find him doubled over, gasping for breath, clutching his stomach. He has spent every ounce of his vitality in those 30 minutes on the parade ground. He is vomiting, shaking, his body rejecting the stress he has forced upon it. But he cannot sleep, because while Monghyr has fallen, the rebellion is not dead. 100 miles away, at the garrison of Patna, the situation is far worse. The officers there are more radical. They have seized the artillery park. They have barricaded the gates. And unlike the men at Monghyr, they have not yet looked into the eyes of Sabat Jung. News arrives by galloper that the officers at Patna are preparing to march. They are threatening to join forces with the Maratha army if their demands are not met. This is the nightmare scenario, a British brigade defecting to the enemy. Clive forces himself up. He calls for more opium. He calls for fresh horses. His doctors tell him that another journey will kill him. He tells them to go to hell. "The work is half done," he rasps. "Patna must be saved." The staring contest at Monghyr was a victory of theatre and reputation, but Patna will be different. Patna will be a confrontation at the edge of a blade. There, the officers are not just angry, they are violent. They have already threatened to blow the loyalist commanders from the mouths of cannons. They are cornered animals, and cornered animals bite. Clive limps back to the river. The storm clouds are gathering again. The heat is rising. He steps onto the boat, a dying man going to fight a living war. As the barge pushes off, he looks back at the walls of Monghyr. The Union Jack is still flying. The Sepoys are still at their posts. He has held the line. But as he looks upstream toward the dark waters of the Ganges, he knows the abyss is waiting for him at Patna, and this time it might stare back. If Monghyr was a tragedy of misplaced honor, Patna was a descent into anarchy. To understand the peril Robert Clive now faced, we must understand the geography of fear. Monghyr was a garrison town, a depot deep within the safety of the company's territory, but Patna was different. Patna was the frontier. It sat on the very edge of British influence, staring across the river into the hostile lands of Oudh. Here, the comforts of civilization were distant memories. The officers stationed at Patna were harder men, frayed by the constant proximity to danger, their nerves shredded by the ceaseless rumors of Maratha invasions. In the sweltering heat of late May, the garrison at Patna had ceased to be a military unit. It had become a mob. Reports reaching Clive's boat as he struggled upriver were terrifying. The officers at Patna had not just resigned, they had effectively seized the city. They had taken control of the artillery park, the heavy guns that could level a fortress in an hour. They had barricaded the gates. Even more disturbingly, there were whispers that they were in correspondence with the enemy. Desperate men do desperate things, and the fear was that if Clive pushed them too hard, they would not just quit, they would defect. Imagine the catastrophe of a fully trained, fully equipped British brigade marching over the border to join the armies of the Indian princes. It would be the end of the Raj before it had truly begun. Clive knew this. As his barge fought the current, he lay in the darkness of his cabin, his body a wreck. The stress of Monghyr had shattered his health. He was vomiting blood. His limbs shook with such violence that he could barely hold a pen. He was kept alive by the sheer, stubborn refusal to die before the job was done. He knew he was sailing into a trap. At Monghyr, he had used shame. At Patna, he knew he would have to use something far more dangerous. He would have to use his own life as a bargaining chip. The arrival at Patna is a scene straight out of a nightmare. The heat is apocalyptic, the sun bleaching the color out of the landscape. The riverbank is silent. There is no welcoming committee. The gates of the city are shut. The sentries on the walls are wearing the company's red coats, but they watch the governor's approach with the sullen hostility of prison guards. Clive lands. He has to be helped ashore, his boots sinking into the hot mud. He is surrounded by a small knot of loyalists, mostly senior officers who had refused to join the conspiracy. They look terrified. They tell Clive that the mutineers are drunk, violent, and armed. They warn him not to enter the cantonment. They beg him to wait for reinforcements. Clive ignores them. He adjusts his coat, grips his cane, and begins to walk. He enters the garrison not through the main gate, which is barred, but through a side entrance, limping into the heart of the conspiracy. The scene that greets him is one of dissolution. Discipline has collapsed. Officers are lounging in the shade, unbuttoned, unshaven, drinking in the middle of the day. But the moment they see him, the atmosphere snaps tight. These men are not like the wavering boys at Monghyr. These are men who have convinced themselves that Clive is a tyrant, a monster who wants to starve them and their families. As he approaches the main square, a group of officers blocks his path. They are armed with muskets and swords. Their hands are shaking, not with fear, but with adrenaline. This is the edge of the blade. There is a moment in every great conflict where history holds its breath. This is that moment. Clive stops. He is surrounded. The shouting begins, angry, incoherent demands for pay, for pardon, for justice. One officer, his face twisted with rage, steps forward, his hand resting menacingly on the pistol in his belt. He shouts that they will not be treated like dogs. He shouts that they are ready to fight for their rights. Clive looks at him. The governor is unarmed. He is outnumbered. He is physically broken. But he possesses a weapon that these men cannot comprehend, an absolute lack of fear. Clive does not shout back. He does not argue. He steps closer, closing the distance until he is almost touching the man with the pistol. He opens his arms, exposing his chest. It is a gesture of supreme theatricality, but it is also a dare. "If you wish to shoot your governor," Clive says, his voice cutting through the heat like a razor, "then shoot him. I am here. I am unarmed. Do it." The silence that follows is deafening. The officer stares at him. To shoot Robert Clive is not just murder, it is patricide. It is killing the father of the army. It is shooting the living symbol of British victory. The man's hand hovers over the pistol. He looks into Clive's eyes, those cold, heavy-lidded eyes that have seen the slaughter of thousands, and he sees something that terrifies him. He sees a man who does not care if he lives or dies, as long as he wins. The officer blinks. He steps back. The pistol stays in his belt. But the danger is not over. The mob is still angry. They are shouting again, surging forward. It seems for a moment that they might tear him apart with their bare hands. Then the ground begins to rumble. From the periphery of the square, a sound emerges, the rhythmic, heavy tramp of boots. The mutinous officers spin around. Marching onto the parade ground in perfect formation are the Sepoy battalions, the Indian troops. Clive had sent his orders ahead here too. He had mobilized the native regiments, the men who had fought for him at Plassey, the men who revered him as a demigod. They march into the square, their faces impassive, their discipline absolute. They form a wall of steel around Clive and the loyalist officers. They fix bayonets. The metallic clack-clack of hundreds of bayonets locking into place echoes off the barrack walls. The irony is shattering. The masters of India, the white officers who believed they were the superior race, the indispensable leaders, now find themselves staring down the barrels of the very men they were supposed to command. The racial hierarchy of the empire is turned upside down. The brown soldiers are the enforcers of the state. The white officers are the criminals. Clive turns to the mutineers. He is safe now, behind a wall of loyal bayonets, but he does not hide. He steps through the ranks of the Sepoys, standing once again in the open. "Look at yourselves," he rasps, pointing a trembling finger at them. "You call yourselves Englishmen, you call yourselves soldiers, you are being guarded by the very men you are supposed to lead. You have disgraced your king, you have disgraced your country, and you have disgraced me." He tells them that the game is over. He tells them that the artillery has been secured by loyalists. He tells them that reinforcements are marching from Calcutta. He gives them a choice: surrender now, return to your duty, and throw yourselves on the mercy of the court, or be arrested as common criminals and marched to the coast in chains. The rebellion at Patna dies in that moment. It does not die with a battle. It dies with a realization. The officers look at the Sepoys, standing rock still with their muskets leveled. They look at Clive, the sick old lion who refused to back down, and they realize that they are alone. The illusion of their power has evaporated. They are not the army. They are just a group of greedy men who tried to hold a government to ransom and failed. One by one, the swords are unbuckled. One by one, the heads bow. The anger drains away, replaced by the cold, sick realization of what they have done. They have committed mutiny. They have forfeited their careers, their honor, and perhaps their lives. Clive watches them surrender. He does not gloat. He feels no triumph, only an immense crushing fatigue. The adrenaline that sustained him through the confrontation drains away, leaving him hollow. He watches as the ringleaders are rounded up. He watches as the artillery is reclaimed. He has done the impossible. He has quelled a mutiny of the entire officer corps without firing a single shot. He has saved the Bengal army from itself. But the cost is visible on his face. As he turns to walk back to his quarters, he stumbles. His aides catch him. He is burning with fever. His mind is beginning to fracture under the strain. He has held the empire together with his own 2 hands, but he has squeezed himself dry in the process. The confrontation at Patna was the high-water mark of Clive's authority. It was the moment where his personal legend proved stronger than the collective will of an army. But as the sun sets over the Ganges, casting long, bloody shadows across the garrison, a new reality begins to set in. The mutiny is over, but the reckoning is just beginning. These men, these officers who are now prisoners, have powerful friends in England. They have families who vote in Parliament. They will not forgive the man who humiliated them. Clive has won the Battle of the Barracks, but he has started a war that will follow him all the way back to London, a war of whispers, of lawsuits, and of political assassination. He has sharpened the blade that will eventually cut him down. But for now, in the heat of the Indian night, there is only the silence of the parade ground and the heavy breathing of a man who has looked into the abyss and forced it to blink. In the grand calculus of the mutiny, the officers had accounted for everything. They had calculated the travel time of the dispatches. They had calculated the financial pressure on the company's stock. They had calculated the political weakness of the government in Calcutta, but they had failed to calculate the one variable that would ultimately decide their fate. They had forgotten to look at the men standing quietly in the background, polishing their muskets and guarding their tents. They had forgotten the Sepoys. To the European officers of 1766, the Indian soldier was an instrument, a tool of war, forged by British discipline, sharpened by British drill, and wielded by British command. In the racial hierarchy of the 18th century, it was inconceivable to a captain or a major that native troops would ever dream of disobeying a white officer. The mutineers assumed that if they walked away, the Sepoys would follow. They assumed that the loyalty of the regiments belonged to them personally, not to the distant abstraction of the East India Company. It was an arrogance born of hubris, and it would prove to be their undoing. What the officers failed to understand was that the Sepoys did not see Robert Clive as a distant administrator. To the British aristocracy, Clive was a controversial upstart, but to the soldiers of the Bengal army, he was Sabat Jung, the daring in war. He was a mythological figure, the man who had stood on the walls of Arcot while the bullets hummed around him like angry wasps. He was the man who had brought them victory after victory, who had filled their pockets with prize money and their names with honor. There was a bond between Clive and the Indian troops that transcended rank and race. It was a bond forged in the dust and blood of the Carnatic Wars, a shared history that the new young officers from England simply did not possess. When Clive sent his secret orders to the Indian commanders, the subadars and jemadars, he was not issuing a bureaucratic directive. He was calling in a debt of honor. The response was immediate and absolute. As the mutiny reached its fever pitch, a strange and unsettling silence fell over the Sepoy lines. The European officers, busy drinking toasts to their rebellion, began to notice that their orders were being met with a peculiar stiffness. The easy camaraderie of the camp vanished. When the mutineers tried to incite the troops, telling them that the company was ruined and that they should follow their officers into independence, they were met with blank stares. The Sepoy operates on a concept known as namak, the salt. To eat the salt of a master is to bind oneself to him with a loyalty that is almost spiritual. The Sepoys had eaten the salt of the company. They were paid by the company. Their pensions came from the company. And the living embodiment of that company was not the drunken captain shouting in the mess tent, but the grim-faced governor sailing up the river. The twist of fate occurred with the precision of a trap snapping shut. When Clive arrived at the garrisons, he did not need to bring a British army to fight the mutineers. He simply turned the key in the lock that the officers had built for themselves. He ordered the Sepoys to stand to arms, and for the first time in the history of the British Raj, the order was to level their muskets not at a foreign enemy, but at their own European officers. The scene must have been surreal. Imagine the humiliation of a British captain, a man who believes himself to be the pinnacle of civilization, suddenly finding himself surrounded by a wall of red coats and brown faces. He reaches for his sword, only to find a bayonet pressed against his chest. He looks into the eyes of a soldier he has commanded for years, a man he perhaps whipped for a dirty uniform just yesterday, and sees no hesitation. The Sepoys did not gloat. They did not riot. They simply obeyed the higher power. They formed cordons around the European barracks. They seized the ammunition stores. They manned the artillery. In a complete inversion of the colonial order, the natives became the guardians of the state, and the masters became the prisoners. This was the moment the mutiny truly died. It was not the threat of court-martial that broke the officers' spirit. It was the shame. To be disarmed by their own troops was a professional disgrace from which there was no recovery. It stripped them of their authority more effectively than any written order. It proved to them that they were not indispensable. The machine of the Bengal army could function perfectly well without them, as long as Sabat Jung was at the helm. There is a profound irony in this chapter of history. The British Empire in India was built on the premise of European superiority, the idea that a handful of British officers were necessary to lead the chaotic masses of India. Yet in the moment of supreme crisis, it was the British officers who descended into anarchy, greed, and treason. And it was the Indian soldiers who displayed the discipline, the loyalty, and the restraint that saved the British administration from collapse. Clive knew exactly what he was doing. He was playing a dangerous game, lighting a fuse that could have blown the entire racial structure of the empire to pieces. By empowering the Sepoys to arrest their white officers, he was showing them their own strength. He was pulling back the curtain on the fragility of British rule. But Clive was a pragmatist, not a philosopher. He needed to win, and he used the weapon at hand. He walked among the Sepoy lines, distributing rewards, praising their fidelity. He called them his faithful children. He cemented a relationship that would become the cornerstone of British rule for the next 90 years. The Sepoy general had returned, and his army had chosen him over their immediate superiors. For the mutineers, the psychological blow was fatal. They realized they were alone in a hostile land. Without the support of the troops, they were just 200 men stranded in the middle of India, surrounded by millions of potential enemies. The Marathas were watching. The emperor was watching. If the Sepoys abandoned them, they would be slaughtered. And so the resistance evaporated. The officers who had sworn oaths on the Bible, who had pledged to die rather than submit, now found themselves handing over their swords to Indian sergeants. They were marched into confinement under the watchful eyes of the very men they had planned to use as pawns. The twist of fate was complete. The White Mutiny was crushed not by white soldiers, but by the unwavering fidelity of the Indian Sepoys. It was a victory that saved the empire, but it left a lingering question in the humid air of Bengal, a question that would haunt the British for a century to come. If the power of the Raj truly rested on the loyalty of the Sepoy, what would happen if, one day, the Sepoy decided to change his mind? But that was a nightmare for another century. For now, Robert Clive stood triumphant. He had faced down the men of his own race and won, backed by the silent, steady ranks of his faithful children. The crisis was over. The shouting had stopped. Now all that remained was the silence of the aftermath and the bitter taste of a victory won at a terrible personal cost. The silence that follows a mutiny is heavier than the noise of battle. In the summer of 1766, as the monsoon rains finally broke over the parched plains of Bengal, Robert Clive found himself the master of a silent, sullen army. The guns had been lowered. The swords had been sheathed. The White Mutiny, that great and terrible gamble by the officer corps, had collapsed under the weight of one man's will. But victory, in the world of Robert Clive, always came with a price tag attached. Immediate aftermath of the rebellion was a curious mix of ruthlessness and mercy. History often paints Clive as a tyrant, a man of blood and iron. Yet, as he sat in judgment over the men who had tried to destroy him, he displayed a moderation that baffled his contemporaries. He knew that he could not hang 200 officers. To do so would be to stain the reputation of the British Army forever. He understood that many of these men were young, foolish, and led astray by their seniors. So the lion sheathed his claws. He ordered the ringleaders, men like Sir Robert Fletcher, the double-dealing commander who had stoked the fires of treason, to be arrested and court-martialed. They were stripped of their commissions, humiliated, and shipped back to England in disgrace. But for the rank and file, for the young lieutenants and ensigns who had merely followed the herd, Clive offered a grudging forgiveness. He allowed them to return to their posts, provided they signed a new covenant of loyalty and swore to never again question the orders of the civil power. It was a pragmatic decision necessary to keep the army functional, but it was also a fatal error. By dismissing the ringleaders rather than executing them, Clive sent a ship full of enemies back to London. These were not just disgraced soldiers, they were men consumed by hatred. They had been broken by Clive, publicly shamed by him, and financially ruined by his reforms. As they sailed down the Hooghly River, watching the coast of India disappear, they did not vow repentance. They vowed revenge. They carried with them stories of Clive's tyranny, his corruption, and his Oriental despotism. They would become the witnesses for the prosecution in the political trial that was already brewing in Westminster. Clive had won the war in Bengal, but he had armed the soldiers for the war in England. But the most immediate casualty of the victory was Clive himself. The human body is not designed to sustain the level of stress that Robert Clive had endured for 18 months. He had fought a war on two fronts, against the corruption of the civilians and the treason of the soldiers. He had done it while battling a chronic, agonizing illness that was slowly eating him alive from the inside. He had survived on adrenaline, opium, and sheer spite. Now, with the crisis past, the adrenaline faded, and the collapse was total. In the late months of 1766, the governor of Bengal was a ghost haunting his own palace. He could barely walk. His mind, once a diamond of clarity, was now clouded by the heavy doses of laudanum he required just to get out of bed. He was prone to fits of weeping, sinking into deep, black depressions where he would sit for hours, staring at the wall, unable to speak. The nervous ambition that had driven him since boyhood had burned itself out, leaving behind only ash. He wrote to the directors in London, begging to be allowed to return home. "My constitution is ruined," he admitted. "I have not a day to live." Yet even in this state, he continued to work. He finalized the dual system of government, a complex administrative structure that would allow the company to collect the revenues of Bengal while leaving the judicial administration in the hands of the Nawab. It was a flawed system, a patch on a leaking dam, but it bought the company time. He stabilized the currency. He secured the borders. He did the work of 10 men while looking like a man who belonged in a hospice. By January 1767, it was over. The ships were waiting in the harbor. Clive attended his final council meeting, a shadow of the man who had arrived just 2 years earlier. He looked around the table at the new men he had installed, the system he had built. He had done exactly what he said he would do. He had cleansed the Augean stables. He had crushed the rebellion. He had saved the British Empire in India from dissolving into anarchy. But as he walked down the steps of Government House for the last time, there were no cheering crowds. The civilians still hated him for stopping their private trade. The army still hated him for cutting their pay. He was leaving India not as a beloved hero, but as a feared schoolmaster who had disciplined an unruly class. He boarded the ship Britannia with his wife and a small retinue. As the coast of Bengal faded into the mist, Robert Clive must have felt a profound sense of relief. He was going home. He was going to his estates, to his family, to the peace and quiet of the English countryside. He imagined a retirement filled with honor, perhaps an earldom, a seat in the House of Lords where he could rest on his laurels. He was wrong. He had left the battlefield of bullets and bayonets only to enter a battlefield of whispers and writs. He had saved the company, but the company was ungrateful. He had enriched his country, but his country was suspicious. He was bringing home a fortune, but he was also bringing home a target on his back. The cost of victory was not just his health, it was his peace of mind. He had spent his life fighting impossible odds, believing that if he just won the next battle, he would finally be safe. But on that long voyage home, gazing at the grey horizon of the Atlantic, Clive began to realize the terrible truth. The war was not over, the enemy had simply changed shape, and this time he was too tired to fight. There are victories that break a man more completely than any defeat. Robert Clive returned to England in the summer of 1767, believing he had earned his rest. He had secured the richest province in Asia for the crown. He had quelled a mutiny that threatened the very existence of the empire. He had balanced the books, secured the borders, and established a system of government that would last for nearly a century. He expected gratitude. He expected an English earldom. He expected, at the very least, peace. Instead, he walked into a political ambush that made the conspiracy at Monghyr look like a playground squabble. London in the 1770s was a city simmering with class resentment. The landed gentry, the old families whose wealth was tied up in acres and sheep, looked with horror at the new money flooding in from the east. They saw men like Clive, the nabobs, returning with diamonds in their pockets and buying up the countryside. They saw them inflating the price of rotten boroughs, corrupting the purity of Parliament, and flaunting a wealth that seemed alien and immoral. To the average Englishman, Robert Clive was not a hero. He was Lord Vulture, a caricature of greed, a man who had starved Bengal to feed his own vanity. The attacks began almost immediately. Pamphlets circulated in the coffee houses, accusing him of every crime imaginable, of forgery, of murder, of creating the famine that was ravaging India. His enemies in the East India Company, the very men he had fired for corruption, had returned before him and poisoned the well. They whispered in the ears of ministers. They formed committees. They prepared the ground for a public lynching. Clive, already sick and mentally fragile, found himself fighting for his reputation in the one arena where his military genius was useless, the House of Commons. The investigation that followed was a spectacle of hypocrisy. Parliament, a body famous for its own corruption, decided to put Clive on trial for receiving gifts after the Battle of Plassey, gifts that were standard practice in Indian diplomacy at the time. Leading the charge was General John Burgoyne, a man who would later achieve infamy by losing the American colonies, but who now found it convenient to attack the man who had won India. Clive stood before the committee, not as a defendant, but with the haughty grandeur of a fallen king. He was in pain. The opium clouded his eyes, but his voice remained steady. He described the moment after Plassey, walking through the treasury of the Nawab, piles of gold and jewels on every side, with the power to take it all. "Mr. Chairman," he thundered, in one of the most famous defenses in parliamentary history, "at this moment I stand astonished at my own moderation." It was a line of breathtaking arrogance, but it was also true. He had taken a fortune, yes, but he could have taken a kingdom. He reminded them that while they were debating ethics in the safety of Westminster, he had been holding the line against the French and the Marathas. He asked them a simple question. If the government was so eager to condemn his methods, why were they so eager to keep the money his methods had generated? Parliament was trapped. To condemn Clive would be to question the legitimacy of the British presence in India. In the end, They passed a resolution that was a masterpiece of political equivocation. They voted that Robert Clive had indeed received £234,000, but they also voted that Robert Clive did, at the same time, render great and meritorious services to his country. He was technically cleared, but he was morally destroyed. The meritorious service vote was a tombstone, not a laurel wreath. Clive left Parliament a broken man. The strain of the trial had shattered what little health he had left. The nervous melancholy that had dogged him since his youth now consumed him entirely. He retreated to his house in Berkeley Square, shutting out the world. The year is 1774. Outside, the winter fog is rolling through the streets of Mayfair. Inside, the curtains are drawn. The greatest soldier of his generation sits alone in his library. The pain in his gut is now constant, a screaming agony that requires ever-increasing doses of opium to dampen. But the drug does not bring sleep. It brings nightmares. It amplifies the voices of his accusers. It replays the faces of the men he deceived, the treaties he forged, the friends he lost. He is 49 years old, but he looks 70. His hands shake so violently he can barely hold a teacup. He is isolated. The aristocracy still shuns him. The company has moved on. The king is silent. He is a titan stranded on an island of his own making, surrounded by wealth he cannot enjoy and memories he cannot escape. On the 22nd of November, shortly after midday, the pain becomes too much. Or perhaps it is not the physical pain, but the silence. There are many stories about how it happened. Some say he used a razor, others say a pistol, but the most reliable accounts suggest a small penknife, a tool for sharpening quills. It is a quiet, almost bureaucratic end for a man of war. There is no final speech, no dramatic battle cry, just a solitary figure in a dim room making one last, decisive cut to end the suffering. Clive of India, the man who had dodged death 1,000 times on the battlefield, the man who had survived the monsoons, the mutinies, and the Marathas, died by his own hand in the heart of the empire he built. He was buried in a secret grave, at night, without a plaque, in the small church of Mutiny. The establishment wanted him forgotten. They wanted the money, but they did not want the man. But history has a way of resurfacing. As we look back on the life of Robert Clive, we are left with a profoundly uncomfortable legacy. He was not a good man in the conventional sense. He was ruthless, greedy, and often duplicitous. He unleashed forces of commerce and conquest that would cause immense suffering. And yet, without him, the map of the world would look very different today. He was the necessary monster of the British Empire, the man with the iron will to do the dirty work that allowed Victorian England to pretend its hands were clean. His life serves as a terrifying reminder of the cost of ambition. He sought to conquer the world, and he succeeded. But in the process, he lost himself. The tragedy of Robert Clive is not that he died young or that he died by suicide. The tragedy is that he was a man who could command armies, who could stare down a mutiny of 200 officers, who could reshape the destiny of a subcontinent, but who could not conquer the darkness in his own mind. The general who refused to retreat finally found the one enemy he could not defeat. And in the silence of that room in Berkeley Square, the lion of Plassey finally stopped roaring.